Go ahead and again, if you disagree, please do it in the comments. But this uses descending armor class. Hello and welcome to every edition of the Tabletop RPG Talk Show. I'm Jon.
I'm Jesse.
Today we're going to loot the body and take a look at Hyperborea, the third edition of this role-playing game from Northwind Games.
In our random encounter, we're going to be talking about the top 5 sort of tabletop industry words and jargon that are non sort of daily use words that maybe some people might be unfamiliar with.
That's right. And of course, we'll have a morale check where we'll check in with the news of the week for the tabletop role-playing game industry. But first, Jesse, what's new?
What's new? There is a cafe that's a sort of hobby shop, anime kind of cafe near me that just opened up.
Cool.
And they're starting to get into more and more events and trying to get a feel for what the local community wants or needs. And they had a D&D night just the other week, and it was insane.
Cool.
It was like I volunteered to DM if need be. I came prepared with things ready to go, one shot, all my supplies and whatnot. But I fully expected to participate in the one table that would be there.
Right.
That would, there was going to be like all DMs or something and like maybe one kid or something. But there were like over 30 people.
Yeah.
They just kept coming in and kept coming in. So we kept, we had to find space, and we were like kind of in a corner. But we had 6 tables. It was fantastic. They're going to do another one this month. And I think it'll be just like a regular monthly D&D thing that might even get more frequent than that.
Supporting the local love of tabletop role-playing games, not just the global love. Yeah. It's good. It's good to see that there's some good local events. I know my son went to that gaming night. I did not, because I didn't want to cramp his style. So and I'm sure I just cramped his style by saying that. So there you go.
So Jon, what's new?
Well, so being on the East Coast, I was keeping track of what was happening over in San Diego recently with San Diego Comic-Con, and specifically, different news, somewhat related to tabletop role-playing games and stuff. I was paying particular attention to what was happening with Masters of the Universe toys.
Sure.
It's another area where I'm a fan and a big nerd, so the one piece of news that has the Masters of the Universe community in a kerfuffle is that Grizzlor will not be released in retail, but will only be available through Mattel Creations, which means that it will be bought by bots.
Oh, just online?
Yeah. And you will have to pay scalper prices for Grizzlor. And it's the second time Grizzlor is being released as Mattel Creations exclusive. So if you're listening, Mattel, knock it off. I thought you liked money. Like, people want to buy this action figure, and you're not letting them. And instead, you're rewarding people with bots and scalpers.
Sure.
Stop it. Just stop it.
Just stop it.
Do an unlimited, like a limited time, unlimited, sign up, buy as many figs as you want. It's the window's open for 2 or 3 days, and then close it.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Give people time.
But let everybody get, come on. You can do this, Mattel. You're not new at making toys. But so anyway, I was having a good time, and if you're in the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe fandom, there were definitely lots of people upset. I enjoy. I don't participate, but I enjoy seeing people get. It's very similar to the owl bear thing.
Yeah, right? With the D&D movie.
With the D&D movie trailer, our Grizzlor was our owl bear moment. For those
sticking on San Diego Comic-Con.
Yeah,
I've been to New York Comic-Con many times, and a lot of times year after year, and every year it's the same. But looking at San Diego Comic-Con, it's always this big, massive event where all these new things are spoiled, and it seems like a lot cooler than New York Comic Con. And it sucks because there's a lot of like Japanese games and things like that I follow.
Yeah.
And because it's on the West Coast, it's way easier for them to get to.
Yeah.
Compared to the East Coast.
Yeah.
So they'll come to the United States, but they'll stay in like LA and San Diego, and then they'll go back to Japan, and it's like, no, come to the East Coast.
Right. Yeah, New York Comic Con hasn't reached the same level as the San Diego Comic Con. I remember New York Comic Con used to be free for teachers.
Oh, yeah.
And that was pretty great if you were in the world of education at all. And when the popularity of San Diego Comic-Con started to take off, that was one of the first things New York Comic-Con did, was they were like, we're shutting down the free teachers, because that's money that we could be making at the door. And they were selling out. So, I guess they were right to do that. It wasn't cool. Because I was going for free for a long time, but whatever. That's all right.
All right, it's time for a morale check. Our morale check is where we take a look at new RPG news of the times and things going on in our industry. Of late, from Wizards of the Coast, we have a new Unearthed Arcana called Wonders of the Multiverse.
Cool.
New stuff from Planescape. There's a new playable race called the Glitchling, which is very, very reminiscent of Modrones, which are various sided type of little robot people, like drones, duo drones. They look like dice, kind of.
Yep.
If you've played Out of the Abyss, you would be very familiar with these creatures. There's also some new backgrounds related to giants and this interesting Cartomancer, which turns you into Gambit, I guess, from
the X-Men.
The X-Men, yeah. And interestingly, Sigil is mentioned by name specifically.
Yep, and you said it at the top of this. I mean, this is all hinting at Planescape.
Yeah.
Whether it's the Plane of Law, the Outlands, the mentioning of Sigil, the world of Mechanus, right, where the Mondrons are from. Like, all this is reeking of Planescapes. And I mean, we said it when the Spelljammer was first revealed. This is how they're thinking about releasing new settings and new campaign settings and stuff. So I think, assuming that Spelljammer's a hit, and all signs point to it being
it likely
one, we're going to get a similar set with an adventure book, a player's book, and a monster manual for Planescape. Probably, I'm guessing at the beginning of 2023.
And this is likely a test for that.
Yep.
Sort of dip your toes in the water for new players who may not be familiar with it.
Yep.
Just to test it out. And
they've been doing stuff for Dragonlance. They did stuff before that for, paved the way for Spelljammer. That's how we knew Spelljammer was coming. So yeah, definitely take a look at this Unearthed Arcana and start getting excited for Planescape. All right. In other news, Necromancer Games and their parent company, Frog God Games, they are releasing new books and products for old school essentials. So if you're like me and you're paying attention to old school essentials and you're excited about old school essentials, Necromancer Games is releasing their first book, which is Whisper and Venom. They're releasing it for 5th edition and for old school essentials. It's kickstarting. But then I'm sure it'll be more readily available after that. It looks like Necromancer Games and Frog God Games is no longer supporting Matt Finch's Swords and Wizardry game. So if you want to continue to support Matt Finch and Swords and Wizardry, you're going to be looking for Mythmere Games, which is Matt Finch's Swords and Wizardry game company. I love Swords and Wizardry. I think it's great if you want to play OE Dungeons and Dragons, if you want to experience the original version of Dungeons and Dragons. But I also love old school essentials, and there is a lot of energy and movement around old school essentials. Lots of energy during Zine Month. Lots of energy during Zine Quest, Zemo, all that stuff. Lots of zines, lots of support. It really is where the OSR seems to be coalescing at this moment. And so it makes sense. I mean, Frog God Games is a business.
Yep.
That's where the energy and where the people are and where the money is. So, it's one door is opening, one door is closing. But if you still, if you still want to be supporting Matt Finch and Swords and Wizardry, Swords and Wizardry, check out Mythmere Games. That's where you can find the continuing support for that. I'm sure there's going to be a new Swords and Wizardry core book coming out soon.
Yeah, likely. Paizo is celebrating 15 years. 15 years.
15 years.
Jeez. With a re-release of their Crown of the Kobold King saga.
Boom.
I've played through this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was one of the first times I played D&D back in 3.5.
Okay, great.
My DM had used this.
Cool.
So they're doing a new hardcover that'll be updated for Pathfinder 2nd edition. For anybody that plays Pathfinder or Pathfinder 2.0, I'm sure it's likely easily transported into 5th edition as well. If you can't find that, I'm sure somebody has already done it.
Yeah.
But it's a new re-release with a new hardcover, so something new to collect.
Yeah, when I had a recent experience, I got a chance to try Pathfinder 2nd edition for the first time at Origins. And it has this, what makes it distinct from 5th edition and from other versions of fantasy role-playing games is it has this 3-action system, right? And so you have 3 actions every turn, and you can spend each of those actions in different ways. And sometimes a spell will cost you 2 actions, or you can take a feat to have something that would cost you 2 actions only cost you 1. That's the economy of the game, right? It feels very magic-y.
Sure.
In that way, right? And so if you want a little bit more of that kind of mechanism, check out 2nd edition Pathfinder. It is a little bit more rules heavy, and I'm trying not to use jargon right now that we're going to be that we're going to be talking about, but it is a little bit more rules heavy, I think, than 5th edition. A little bit more crunchy.
Yeah, a little crunchy.
Right.
Does have a lot of customization.
Does have a lot of customization, which has always been the hallmark for Pathfinder. And finally, if you missed the Kickstarter for Call of Cthulhu Classics, which is the re-release of, I believe, the 2nd edition of Call of Cthulhu, they are going to be available with 2 upcoming opportunities. If you happen to be at Gen Con, check out the Chaosium booth, and they're going to have some copies of Call of Cthulhu Classics there. And then they're also going to have some available on the Chaosium website. And once they're gone, though, they're gone. That's it for Call of Cthulhu Classics. It was a great Kickstarter. Great to have that stuff back in print. Nice, big, fat box set with lots of supplements and things. I can remember this was the box set that my dad had.
Nice.
And so when I was a kid, this was definitely something I was poring over. It's I have pieces of it.
Sure.
But not actually a nice condition box set. So it was a no-brainer for me to jump on that Kickstarter. But if you missed it, Call of Cthulhu Classics, check out Chaosium website. Or if you're lucky enough to be at Gen Con, you can pick it up at the Chaosium booth.
Riders of Rohan, Gondor calls for your aid. Every edition, we have a new goal on the horizon that we're setting our sights on. The road to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube.
If you're from the 90s, the call might be regulators mount up.
We had a goal initially of 100 subs, and we sort of blew past that.
Yep.
That was fantastic, and we really appreciate everybody who chooses to spend their time watching and listening to our podcast. It's really exciting and fun to make, and we love sharing this industry with everybody. But the next big milestone is 1,000 subs.
And it'll really give us the ability to take every edition to the next point, next growth point for us. So help us out. Spread the word. EveryEditionRPG.com. That's our website where you can find links to all of our socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can also find links to our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcast. And, of course, thanks to everyone who is watching on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe. Hit the like button. Drop a comment. Let us know how you feel about the show or how you feel about this particular episode, how it's going. We really, really appreciate anything that you can do to help spread the word and help us continue to share our love and enthusiasm for the tabletop role-playing game industry and for playing tabletop role-playing games and collecting tabletop role-playing games. So thank you. All right, it's time for a random encounter. Today's random encounter, we are going to be talking about Jargon. tabletop RPG vocabulary words. Words.
Grab your notebooks.
Grab your notebooks, everybody. Words that we probably use too much or all the time, that maybe if you're a newer player, you're confused about. And so we wanted to be welcoming and sort of talk about some of the maybe more confusing or esoteric words that are out there that we use all the time. But before we do that, Jesse, we're both wearing red shirts.
This was not planned.
This was not planned. What is this all about? I feel like we're
feeling the summer heat, you know?
Yeah, or we're gonna be on an away mission and not come back. What? We'll have to
bring me my red shirt.
We're gonna need to coordinate, I think, next time. But at any rate, our first. Let's take a look at our first word for today, which I know I'm guilty of using all the time. OSR. So OSR stands for Old School Renaissance. It could also stand for Old School Revival or Old School Revolution. Whatever, way you want to
old school.
Transform that R word. It's old school tabletop role playing. So
what does old school mean?
What is it? Right. So what is it? It's a game that's going to harken back to an earlier version of role playing, like first edition Dungeons and Dragons or basic edition Dungeons and Dragons or original edition Dungeons and Dragons. So D&D from the 70s and 80s primarily, but OSR can also mean other types of games, not just Dungeons and Dragons. So the distinguishing feature though of an OSR game is that it has some kind of feel. That it really does sort of bring back nostalgia for those people that have played those games back in the 70s and 80s and maybe were kids back then, or tries to evoke that feeling in newer players. So it definitely has some nostalgia.
I think
about it.
There's a couple bits of OSR that really hit home with me. You know, I was not alive in the 70s for D&D, so that nostalgia doesn't hit me quite the same way. But when I think OSR, I think of the artwork, like the artwork from Dungeon Crawl Classics that is very reminiscent of the original D&D artwork from the Monster Manual or whatever. Also, the rules set. It might use THAC0 or Descending Armor Class, or it may use a system where races are the same as classes, or there's very few options in customization, or it uses another word that we're going to talk about later that is more rules heavy.
Right.
So there's a very particular feel that the game would have.
I think one of the other characteristics of an OSR game would be the idea that it is potentially lethal, right?
Sure.
That your character is not guaranteed to survive, right? I think one of the major complaints that people have against 5th edition is often that they don't feel like their characters are actually threatened in any real way because there's such an emphasis on balance. An OSR game is often not going to care about balance, right? So I'll give you a classic example of like an OSR adventure. An OSR adventure would have a lich or a dragon or something like that. Right. And in it, and not care that you're a first level character. Your job, if you encounter that thing, is to run. And if you're not smart enough to realize that, then you're going to learn the hard way, right? So there's this kind of like mentality to it. Whereas, again, if you're playing a 5th edition adventure, you know that everything's perfectly balanced. Maybe, right? One of the great ways that you can mess with 5th edition, I think, is to unbalance it.
Imbalance
it. Throw your players off. If you...
Why does it take so many hits for that kobold to die?
Right.
You'll find out.
That's right. Yeah, throw your players off. Don't make it so predictable. But the OSR, right, has a little bit more emphasis on lethality, of it being lethal. And it's a little bit more, a lot less emphasis on balance.
I think that comes from also the customization. If you spend an hour or two with a group of people creating a character in 5th edition for them, they go through their race, their class, their background, all their stats and everything. And then you go into your first adventure and you die, you've now wasted all that time.
Yep.
In an OSR game, you can roll up a character fairly quickly and get sort of right back into the game.
Right. Yep. So yeah, less emphasis on character customization, more emphasis on, I would say the other thing too, less emphasis on storytelling. I think not to say that there isn't storytelling, but to me an OSR game is going to feel a little bit more like you're playing a game. I don't know how else to say.
You're in a dungeon.
You're right. Yeah,
it's Dungeons and Dragons.
More of a dungeon crawl, type of experience, but it's less about. I don't know, and maybe this is different for different people, but I tend to feel like an OSR game is going to feel more like a game and less about this sort of shared narrative.
Sure.
So, and I'm sure, please push back against that in the comments if you agree or disagree with that particular statement. That's my sort of take on OSR. All right, so what's our number 2 word?
Number 2, crunch.
Crunch.
That's such a harsh word for such a harsh mechanic. I think one of the main differences between an OSR game and a game like 5th edition, a more modern game, even in some of the other games that aren't just Dungeons and Dragons, is crunch. Crunch means rules heavy,
right?
Math heavy,
right?
A lot of sitting down, poring over a book, flipping pages, doing math, adding a bunch, subtracting a bunch to your roll,
checking a table,
looking at a bunch of tables,
a matrix.
Yeah. Again, less on the actual narrative. There's been, at least in the 5th edition marketplace, the idea of like sort of having your head up and telling a story together and looking at your character sheet or books only when it's absolutely necessary. With crunch or a crunchy game, like maybe Pathfinder, you might have to look up things a little bit more because their books are tomes and no one person could ever know everything. Or you might, in like Dungeon Crawl Classics, roll for a spell or use some sort of fighter feature where you have to look at a table or roll on a table to see what happens.
I'd never heard that before. You mentioned a heads up versus sort of a heads down type of experience. That head down is going to be rules heavy. It's going to be crunchy. It's going to, you're looking stuff up. That's interesting. And the rules lighter, right? Is going to be, my head is up.
Yeah.
I never heard that before, but that makes a lot of sense to me. Sometimes I want to play a game where I'm, I guess, heads down.
Yeah.
Like I don't mind crunch. When we talked about the Marvel role-playing game playtest, I was surprised at the amount of crunch, how rules heavy it was, how much math there was, and how much new players tolerated it.
Yeah.
So we talked about that a little bit in that context. So crunch isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is a certain kind of game.
It has a time and a place.
Right.
And that could be different for different people.
Right. One other context where we might use the word crunch, or where people in the tabletop role-playing game industry and fans might use the word crunch, is when referring to specific types of books or releases. A crunchy book is going to be a book that has a lot of stats.
Sure.
So like a lot of monster stats, or a lot of
like weapon stats
or spells, right? A lot of game mechanics, right? To it. And so if a book is described as being crunchy, it's going to have a lot of stats for the game, right? That brings us to our next word, our third word, which is the opposite of crunch, which is fluff. So oftentimes you might hear a book described, a book that's not crunchy might be fluffy, right? It might be a book that's filled with fluff. And that means ultimately it is filled with lots of narrative.
Yeah, like lore,
ideas, world building, stories, descriptions, all that kind of stuff is going to end up being fluff. And so, when we're talking about a particular book, sometimes we'll talk about sort of the balance between how much crunch, how much fluff, right? And for me anyway, right, a good role-playing book is going to have a nice equilibrium of both.
Sure.
You don't want just fluff, because then it's just a storybook. But you don't just want crunch, because then you don't have any context and you don't have any sort of, pulling on the imagination or some narrative help and some ideas for how to use things. So that's when I think about fluff. I think about it in conjunction with crunch and sort of like having the right balance in a game book.
I think personally, I would rather the extremes. I would rather a book be all crunch and all fluff.
Really?
Conversely, because as someone who consumes a lot of 5th edition and D&D content, there's always a big question of, I'm a player. Should I get this new book, or will my DM get it?
Right.
Are there options in it for me? And most of the time now, the books are maybe not evenly split between them, but they have a lot of story or a campaign, like the Strixhaven book, but they also have character options like backgrounds or spells or whatnot. I think I'd rather them just be completely separate and have the space for a fluff book that a DM can get to world build or whatnot, or like old like fighter or ranger sort of specific supplements that are player supplements. They can be balanced between the two, or just a player specific. Hey, this is all of the different weapons in the game, and here's a new compendium of weapons or monster manual or whatever.
So I don't think then I'd ever get a book that is all fluff.
Okay.
Right, because that I think I'd get the stat book.
Yes,
then,
definitely.
Right? A book that was crunchy, right? I would get that, and then it would be my responsibility to come up with the fluff and with the lore. It made me think, too. One of the appeals I think of a game like Morkborg is that it actually has. Both of them are kind of low.
Yeah,
like it
not much of either.
Yeah, it's not very crunchy because there's not a lot of stats, and it's very rules light. But at the same time, it also doesn't give you a lot of fluff. Like it really just gives you bullet points, and that seems to be a trend in tabletop role playing right now. Is actually low fluff and low crunch.
Easy to get into, easy to get out of.
Yeah, and pick up and go, right? Not a lot of prep. It does seem like that is, in some ways, the future of role-playing, is actually both of these things dialed down, which is interesting because you'd think it would be one or the other, but no. That something that doesn't have a lot of stats and also doesn't have a lot of lore is going to be easier for me to just pick up and go, and then I can fill in the blanks for the missing fluff, for the missing lore, and I can find that I don't actually need lots of rules, right? And so that seems to be the direction that a game like Morkborg or a game like Mazes from 9th Level Games is kind of going.
So our fourth word probably should have been our third word because it's third party. This gets thrown around. Not just in the tabletop industry, but a lot of different industries talk about third-party things or retro clones.
Yeah.
This is everything that's not the main pillars of our industry.
The main publisher.
The main publisher is Wizards of the Coast.
Right.
This is whatever whatever you want to say about it. They're a main pillar. You could say Paizo as well.
Yep. Art Talsorian.
Yep. A third party would be somebody coming in as an independent publisher, making content for that game.
Right.
If Goodman Games wants to make a 5th edition supplement, they are then a third party publisher of a 5th edition supplement.
But they are a first party publisher of Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Exactly.
Right, so that's where things can kind of get confusing. The thing about a third party is that for a third party to exist, something like the open gaming license has to exist, right? So Morkborg, which I mentioned before, has an open license, right? And so there are lots of people publishing Morkborg compatible games and adventures and things using their open license.
Creating their own fluff.
And their own crunch.
Yeah, and their own crunch.
That's right. For the OSR.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll use all the words once we get there. But so that's, and you mentioned the word retro clone too.
Yeah.
A retro clone is a third-party game that is essentially a reinterpretation or a reintroduction of an older rule set using an open gaming license as sort of a loophole to kind of release it. So the best example right now, I think, of a retro clone is something like Old School Essentials. So Old School Essentials is put out by Necrotic Gnome, and it is the BX rules, the basic and expert rules of Dungeons and Dragons from the late 70s and into the 80s. But it is using the modern open gaming license from Wizards of the Coast in order to reintroduce those rules and republish those rules so that they are readily available for a new audience. And so a retro clone is going to take some liberties sometimes to offer something new or reinterpret something, but by its very nature, it's also going to reintroduce and stick pretty close to the original rules of a previous system.
It's also a good way for them to take the original rules and start making new additions for them.
Yep.
So you can have sort of the best of both worlds.
Absolutely.
Especially with prices of older books sort of skyrocketing.
Yep.
It's basically impossible for a new player to be like, oh, well, I want to go find out what happened in second edition D&D.
Right.
It's way easier to find a third party that's making some sort of content for it.
Yep. And I've charted out just about every edition. I think at this point, actually, every edition of Dungeons and Dragons has had a retro clone or has currently a retro clone in place that it exists. We're going to be looking at, for our Loot the Body, we're going to be looking at Hyperborea, which is a OSR third-party retro clone of first edition Dungeons and Dragons. And so it offers something new, but at the same time, it really is reminiscent of the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons version of the game. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit.
Our fifth word, Hexcrawl.
Hexcrawl. All right. So a Hexcrawl is a very specific kind of adventure. If you imagine a hexagonal map, right, where all the different hexes are sort of interlocked, basically what a Hexcrawl is an open world sandbox kind of adventure where you would put the map down on the table and you would let your player characters kind of choose what hex they're going to be traveling to and in what order they're going to travel through those hexes. And you have different encounters or different adventures planned for each of those hexes. What order they happen in is going to be completely up to the players and how they decide to travel and traverse your map, but then you've got some idea of what's going to happen or what the possibilities are for each of those hexes. Hex crawls are coming back in popularity, and it seems like in the last couple of years that there's been more of an emphasis on hex crawl. I think people like the freedom as players, but I think DMs and GMs also like the freedom to be a little bit more loose and unpredictable with what's going to happen at the table. And again, it's a break from, we've had almost 10 years now of lots of campaign books.
Epic campaigns.
Epic campaigns in 5th edition. And I think the Hexcrawl is the anti-epic campaign in a lot of ways. And so that's why people are interested in it. They want to do something different than those 5th edition campaign books. And so
it's also a good for maybe a group of people that is too large for any one group. Like maybe you have 12 or 13 players, and only at one time, maybe once a month or whatever, 6 or 7 people can show up for whatever reason. It's really good for sort of drop in, drop out like that, where there's basically no coherent story. It's just sort of a new episode begins, and we take care of the bad guy or the bad situation that the DM creates, and then the episode ends, and then next time it's slightly different.
Well, and the fun, right, is you as the game master, you populate your hexes.
Exactly.
Right? And you don't, like you said, you don't have to have a cohesive story. Rather than trying to rack your brain about writing a cohesive story, or memorizing and digesting somebody else's epic campaign cohesive story, have little sort of one-shots almost, or little encounters, things that, oh, I found this monster that I want to use. Well, bloop, they're in this one hex. Oh, I found this one magic item that I want to use. Well, bloop, it's in this hex. And then like make encounters and adventures for each of them. It's really an exciting, if you've never done a Hexcrawl before or never run it, give it a shot. It's real. I think it's really fun. And then there's a little bit more emphasis then on travel, right? It's so you might want to have some rules for travel, right? For keeping
random
watch and random encounters and that kind of stuff and everything. But it's like I said, it's a type of tabletop role playing adventure that's been around since the beginning, but it seems to be coming back in vogue, right? Becoming cool again as the anti-epic campaign.
Our group's new campaign is essentially a sandbox sort of Hexcrawl adventure.
Yeah.
Because we had just come off the back of an epic campaign where we got to level 17, and we kind of wanted a little change of pace, and we got into my world that I created, and it's impossible to just create everything in a world.
Right.
You're going to want new things, and you're going to want to explore places. So this is a good excuse for me to sort of push the characters to a specific place, and myself learn what might live there and sort of create it as we go.
Yep. And you actually then do end up, like, you create the story together. It's not that you're not involved in a narrative or cooperative storytelling. It's just it's more shared.
Yeah.
Right. It feels
it's very personal.
Yeah. Yeah. And you almost kind of put your own, as players and GMs, you kind of find your own story together that way, right? By having a little bit more choice.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's fun. It is definitely the, if you're a little burnt out on campaign books, give a Hexcrawl a try. Yeah.
With the upcoming Spelljammer, Hexcrawl might be even more viable.
Oh, there you go.
Hexcrawl across planes.
Hexcrawl across the plains, right? Well, and it is with Radiant Citadel book being, like lots of one-shots and stuff. You could set up those adventures to be a Hexcrawl. You'd have a little bit of trouble. Like, again, there's that balance issue.
Yep.
Right? There is that balance issue where all of those Radiant Citadel adventures are meant for a specific level. And that doesn't play nice, right? Like, because if I want to go from what's supposed to be the level 1 adventure to the level 14 adventure, I'm not gonna. It's not gonna be the same way. So in some ways, kind of to bring this all full circle, a Hexcrawl does seem to work best with a more OSR kind of game that doesn't care about balance as much, right? Because again, that emphasis on balance is going to restrict, it feels like, your ability to kind of go wherever you want.
And as a DM, you'd have to spend more time trying to balance things than creating.
Yeah. I'll throw out one more sort of bonus word here. It's a little bit more railroady or on rails, right? Because you have to, if you're all about balance, well, then you have to go from the first level adventure to the second level adventure
without veering,
right, to the third level adventure. And so it's on rails, it's railroady. So you might hear that term too, like, oh, this was a really railroady adventure. I had to do this thing, and then I had to do this thing, and then really I had to do this thing. So there wasn't, there's sort of the, there's not a lot of choice.
Yeah. What tabletop jargon did we miss? I'm sure there are plenty of words that don't make any sense to anybody that's not a nerd for tabletop RPGs.
I'll be sure to use them all coming up in just a couple minutes if you give me a second.
Any words confuse you? Do you disagree with any of the thoughts that we had on our definitions? Let us know in the comments down below. And of course, you could always send us an email over at everyeditionrpg@gmail.com. You can also find links to all of our socials at everyedition.com.
At the end of the day, we're not experts. We really are just fans. Feel free to disagree with us. We probably got something wrong. Do it in the comments, though, because that ends up helping the show. And we appreciate that. So let's have a discussion. I'm sure I got something wrong about the OSR, right? Please, somebody, bring me to task. everyeditionrpg@gmail.com. Or you can find links, like Jesse said, to all of our socials at everyeditionrpg.com. All right, it's time to loot the body. Today's Loot the Body, we are taking a look at the 3rd edition of Hyperborea, Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers role-playing game put out by Northwind Games. So I am new to Hyperborea.
Yep.
This just came in the mail. I kickstarted this 3rd edition book, which is actually broken up into 2 books. There's a player manual and a referee manual. What we're showing, if you're watching on YouTube, is the player manual. But this is an OSR retro clone. See if you did your homework, right? An OSR retro clone of AD&D, but like a lot of retro clones, it does offer its own take, and it does offer something new. So it's not just AD&D without offering something new. So what does this offer that's new? I'm going to talk about Hyperborea, thinking about it, the good, the bad, and the interesting. I'm not going to say it's ugly, because it's actually not ugly. It's interesting. So the good, the bad, and the interesting.
Sure.
So start with the good. The reason to pick up this book is the classes. So there are the 4 core classes, right? There's the fighter, the magician, the cleric, and the thief. Okay? But then the way they handle multi-classing and the way they handle customization is having lots of subclasses.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And so there's a ton of options for fighter subclasses. There's a ton of options for magician, for thief, and for cleric subclasses. Just to name one that stuck out for me, in the magician subclass, there's a pyromancer, an illusionist, a necromancer. Those are all classes that you can play. But the one that's sort of new is a cryomancer, someone who deals in ice. And so you could play, the idea of playing a cryomancer for 10 levels worth of play, plus, to me sounds really interesting.
Yeah, you really specialize.
And really get into it. So that to me is really cool. So right off the bat, I think the thing that's appealing about this is the classes.
So a couple episodes ago, we had talked about old school essentials. And we've made characters in them. And there's always this sort of, if you're going back to an old school game, you're going to be curtailed a little bit.
Limited.
You're going to be limited in your customization. I am someone who really, really likes customization because I like getting into my character if I'm playing.
Yep.
And this sort of handles 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yep.
You get to customize your character while playing in an old school sort of environment, while also taking care of the headaches that come with multi-classing.
Right.
And you get some pretty interesting classes or subclasses in this book. For the thief, there's a ledgered manist. I don't know if I'm saying that word right, but it's a thief that deals sort of with sorcery and thaumaturgy.
Okay.
So it deals with sound and sort of misdirection and things like that, which I really like. And there's a whole slew of these blends of classes that really are different than 5th edition. They're different than any Pathfinder thing. They're really interesting.
Yeah, so for that one in particular, rather than having to multi-class in thief and illusionist, right? You would play, what is this called again?
Ledgered Manist.
Ledgered Manist. You would play that class, and then you don't have to worry about the rigmarole of multi-classing. You've got a class that's laid out for you, and you can follow along. So it brilliantly, I think, takes care of some of the headaches of multi-classing, and lots of options. So that's the good.
Yep.
That's the good of this game. All right, here's the bad. And go ahead and again, if you disagree, please do it in the comments. But this uses descending armor class. It uses an attack matrix. It's pre-Thaco. right? So THAC0 was an attempt to try to take an attack matrix and make it a single number so that it would be something that you could kind of more easily do quickly or in your head. This doesn't even use THAC0. It has an attack matrix, so you have to look on the thing and go, here's my thing, did I hit?
This is crunchy.
Yes, Jesse, thank you. It is rules heavy. It is crunchy. It is head down, right, rather than head up. And I think the truth is, it's just for the sake of nostalgia.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't actually, to me, Descending Armor Class doesn't have any value except nostalgia. I played in a game recently of second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I loved using THAC0. It was so much fun to kind of remember and go back and do that. But the truth is, Descending Armor Class is not going to be new gamer friendly.
Not at all.
Right? So I jokingly put in our show notes for this, I said, this is for the discerning grognard, right? Like, that, to me, that is what Hyperborea is. It's like, I'm a grognard of good taste. Yeah, okay, but you're still a grognard, and and you're only going to sell this book to older players.
So it's fine. That's okay. We're allowed to have that sort of thing in the industry.
Totally.
But it's something to note that you're likely going to have a difficult time if you're running this for any new players or players that may be new to Descending Armor Class, explaining this versus Ascending.
Yep.
And why you're using it at all.
Well, and the truth is, the thing that's brilliant about Old School Essentials and why there's so much energy and weight behind it is because it gives you both, right? Old School Essentials is brilliant because it gives you both Descending Armor Class and Ascending Armor Class, right? So you can do whatever's right for your table in the same book, and that way it can be both nostalgic but also new player friendly. So that, at the end of the day, I think that's a bad. That's me thinking about a broader swath of role-playing. I understand that this is obviously a niche product, which, by the way, includes me, right? Like, I did buy this, and I'm happy I bought it. It's a great game. But I think at the end of the day, Descending Armor Class, time and place. It's not what I want most of the time. All right, so final thoughts then here. What's interesting?
Yeah, interesting.
Right? What's interesting here is the treatment of races in this game. So it's only humans. Interesting, right? I love one of the best pieces of fluff at the beginning of this book is that it talks about the difference between epic fantasy and sword and sorcery. Okay, so this is clearly a sword and sorcery game based on stuff like Conan, right? And the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Jack Vance and all those Appendix N authors that inspired Gary Gygax and Arneson. So it's taking a cue from that rather than Tolkien. Right, Tolkien is where you're going to have your epic high fantasy, and you're going to have elves and dwarves and all these different races. Whereas a Conan story, it's all humans.
Yeah, it's just humans
and some monsters, right? and some magic that sort of leans in an evil direction, right? That magic is corrupting.
Yep.
So they do a fantastic job at the beginning of this book explaining the difference between epic fantasy and swords and sorcery. It's worth a read just for that introduction. It really lays it out. And so what's interesting then is a sword and sorcery game, which is what this is just humans. And so the races are all different human cultures.
Sure.
And the human cultures are based on ancient cultures that really existed, like the Greeks and Romans and Moors, but also on mythical cultures that I don't think existed, like Atlantis, right? Or,
that's a different podcast.
Atlanteans, right? No conspiracy theories. But so there you go. It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's also interesting because race, as treated in this book, has no crunch value.
Yeah, that's just a customization fluff piece.
Yep.
Like, oh, hey, this is what I want to look like. This is basically my background. Easy peasy.
Just for role-playing.
Yeah.
It doesn't change your stats in any way. You don't need certain stats to be from a particular human background or human culture. And so that, to me, is interesting. You would, if you wanted to play a Conan-type sword and sorcery game where it was just humans, this is it, right? This is how you would, one of the ways you want to try it. The other thing I like is, let's say that doesn't sound appealing to you. You don't want to, you don't like that it's these human cultures or what are called races in this book. Well, then you can also just say, well, I'm not going to use that, and I'm just human.
Yeah.
Boop, done. That's it. They call it you're common. Sure. Right, you're just an ordinary human. You're not going to get involved in the backgrounds and stories and fluff of an ancient civilization, and you don't have to. So I like that customization is included here. If you want to do that, you can, and if you don't want anything to do with it, you don't have to.
It also makes for an interesting one-shot or campaign where you're trying to play as a group of people. Like if you think about a D&D group and you sort of look at them, there are all sorts of races. There's lizard people and gnomes and things, and it can be kind of hard for people, if they want to relate to a character because they're not half dragon.
Right.
So if you have a campaign that's all humans, it could hit a little harder, a little closer to home too.
Yeah, cool. So at the end of the day, that's the good, the bad, and the interesting with Hyperborea. I think this is a game that, if you enjoy fantasy role playing, it does offer something different, right? It does offer something that's distinct, and it's worth taking a look at.
Yep.
I don't know that it's something that we're going to bring to the table necessarily, but I'd like to play it. I think I'd sign up for a game or two at a convention.
Yeah, at a convention, I'd definitely try it.
Yeah, and I'm glad that, like I said, I'm glad to have it in the collection, really, because I think I'm going to steal some of those classes, or at least some of those ideas.
They split, there's a sort of huntress type person and a ranger type person.
Yeah.
Two different and distinct sort of ranger types. There's berserkers and different fighters like cavalry, and there's so many awesome things.
Ramped up barbarian.
Yeah.
Right? It's
so many awesome things going on with the subclasses in this book that are just fantastic.
Yeah. So check it out. From Northwind Games, Hyperborea just came out. Check it out. All right, so this has been every edition of the Tabletop RPG Talk Show. Thanks a lot. We hopefully, if you're a new player, you learned something.
Yeah.
And if you're a veteran player, you found something to disagree with.
There's always something.
There's always something to disagree with. But either way, drop a comment, help spread the word. We are on the march, headed towards trying to hit 1,000 subs. We got a ways to go, but we're still less than a year old.
Yeah.
And at the time of this recording, we just had our first episode hit 300 views.
Big milestones.
We're about to hit 1,000 followers on Twitter. About to hit 500 on Facebook. There's momentum, and it's because of all of you. So thank you.
It may not seem like such a big deal with so many YouTube channels having tens of thousands of subscribers, but companies and people really look at these numbers when they're trying to see if it's worth their time being interviewed or anything like that. So this type of stuff helps us get them in front of you in the future. So far, our interviewees have been super gracious and super willing to come on camera and talk with us about their games that they're making, and I hope that trend continues. But the road to 1,000 is really where we start seeing some big jumps in names in the industry.
Yeah, and it starts with you listening right now, subscribing. So if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, and thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching.